Module 4 poses the question, were they scoundrels or sociopaths? That's what we'll explore. Now, most of you have probably heard at least part of this quotation from Lord Acton. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. The rest of that paragraph that he wrote is, great men are almost always bad men. Now, this was Lord Acton writing this letter in 1887, expressing this point of view. We'll see whether Acton's aphorism and principle holds true with these bad men and women. Now, the source of the Encyclopedia Britannica, which is scholarly in its construct, talks about an important personality disorder, the psychopathic personality disorder, the sociopath. The psychopath is characterized, as you can read it, by chronic and continuous antisocial behavior in which the rights of others are violated. One of the more troubling that we'll see today is sociopaths. They generally accept their behavior as natural and they feel no guilt. This is the thing that really makes a sociopath different from the rest of us who have internalized values. They see little reason or possibility for change and they resist therapy. Psychopaths, sociopaths, it's in the sort of same range of personality disorder. Now, here I introduce to you a number of men and women who fit one or the other or both of these categories. Their behaviors and tendencies really marked and stained the 20th century in America. And we will look at these characters and ask ourselves along the way, what can we do, people who hold normal values, people who believe in social norms, what can we do to keep these folks away from upsetting our society and our social order? That's the important question. Meikle Mania. So it's defined in Cambridge as an unnaturally strong wish for power and control, or belief that you are very much more important and powerful than you really are. Now, Jeff Skilling of Enron fame was a megalomaniac. He was now released after 12 years in federal penitentiary. This guy was the CEO of this Enron energy company, and he basically lied to his stockholders, lied to his investors. The business was going down the toilet, but he told them everything was fine. The real crime came when he made his employees rely on his advice when he knew it was false, and they had all of their stock, all their retirement was held in Enron stock, and he drove many people, many individuals into bankruptcy or certainly very poor circumstances. Jeff Skilling, the first of our scoundrels and sociopaths. Al Capone, known to all of us, and you'd have to agree that a criminal character like Al Capone was probably sociopathic. He didn't feel much of a pain of conscience when he extended his criminal empire across Chicago and elsewhere. He paid for his crime to some extent and eventually died in retirement in Florida. Al Capone, another sociopath and scoundrel. Now here's a picture you probably didn't expect to see. Father Charles Coughlin, a man of the cloth, a Roman Catholic priest. He came along late in the 1920s and early in the 1930s when he had a chance to get on the radio and preach. And he was one of those people who was very much entranced by his own fame, and he got 80,000 letters every week. And when he started out, it was about the gospel, and it was about politics, and then it was about the social gospel, what you should do and shouldn't do, and eventually he came to abuse his power. And it was no longer about himself and the gospel. It was all about leading a political movement that he believed would defeat Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He blamed the Jews for Russian communism. He had all sorts of outlandish and outrageous views. Now, the Benedictine College has a pretty good collection of material on Father Coughlin, and there is a lot available online as well if you choose to do some part of his life as one of your major reports. Definitely a scoundrel. Now, General Curtis LeMay was in charge of the firebombing in Japan. He was later chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff under John Kennedy in 1961. Napalm was a new invention back during World War II. It's essentially jellied gasoline, and when it is set afire, you can't rub it out, you can't flush it out. It creates a horrible mess. And he masterminded these raids between March and August of 1945. Now you have to know that the buildings in Japan, because of the nature of the island nation, these buildings were mostly built out of wood. And so this firebombing was going to indiscriminately burn homes, not just factories, not just military targets, but the purpose of the firebombing was to create holy terror in the Japanese people, because again, it was late in the war. We were looking to drive them into submission. But 330,000 people were killed in these raids. I believe that may put him on my list as a scoundrel. Now, most of you haven't heard of this guy, and he is a local Kansas native, Dr. John Brinkley. Dr. John Brinkley was a physician back in the 1920s. He had a patient who came to him who complained about his lack of sexual potency. And he said to the doctor, sort of as an aside, he said, "Why is it that goats, even at advanced ages, seem to be sexually potent? They're always interested and they're always prolific." So Dr. Brinkley took sex glands out of a male goat and implanted them in this fellow. Now there is something called the placebo effect in medicine, and that is basically, if you think you're going to get well, you may get well. And this is exactly what happened to this man. Of course, this man started giving testimonials. Like Coughlin, Brinkley discovered the radio and its tremendous power to spread the message. Well, he got run out of Kansas, he got run out of the United States, they took away his medical license, and all he did was cross the border into Mexico. Now there's something called a clear channel broadcasting AM station. KMOX in St. Louis, 1120, KDKA. These are both very old radio stations back to the 20s. And when they were given the license to broadcast on that frequency, 1120 in the case of KMOX, there were no other channels broadcasting at that signal. So that signal, with a 50,000 watt boost, would carry over enormous broadcast areas. And that's what Brinkley did for himself. He got himself a clear channel station on the other side, and then people would flock down to Texas, cross the border into Mexico, get Brinkley's surgery, both males and females, and he became a rich fraud. I think there is no question that you would characterize him as a great scoundrel of the 20th century. Huey Kingfish Long was at different times governor of Louisiana, then later United States Senator from Louisiana, and he was definitely a megalomaniac. Now the interesting thing about Huey Long is he did start out with nominally good purposes. For example, he looked to pave roads so that farmers in Louisiana could get their crops from the farm to the market. He created a program that for the first time provided free textbooks for children in public schools in Louisiana. That was a good thing. He built one of the great hospitals in Louisiana in the 1930s so that people would have health care. But he was personally a scoundrel. His business practices, his political practices set him aside. And then, like Charles Coughlin, he found out how his message could carry over the radio. And he created this Share Our Wealth program. And he had tens of thousands of people who joined his political movement responding to his message sent widely. Clearly, the Kingfish was a scoundrel. And he was assassinated on the steps of the Capitol in Baton Rouge in 1935. Now, Henry Ford. We know Henry Ford chiefly as the popularizer of automobiles in America. Remember, automobiles were invented in Europe, so there were many companies in America, Ford being just one of them. His contribution, of course, was the assembly line. But Ford bought a newspaper, the Dearborn Independent in Michigan. And unfortunately, Henry Ford, from what I've read, was one of those guys who was brought up around the turn of the century and learned that Jews were, in his view, a stereotypical view, a wrong-headed view, were in charge of money, were in charge of banks, were in charge of all kinds of things. And he spread his anti-Semitic hate through his newspaper. Eventually, as I note here on the slide, under pressure from Jewish groups, he relented and eventually got rid of the newspaper. Some scoundrels of the day themselves say the only reason he relented is because so many people were buying Chevrolets. In whatever case, I put Henry Ford on this list. Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was a very complicated figure of the 20th century. And as you look to the events that led up to his resignation on August 9, 1974, and his near impeachment, he was not impeached, you can see that Nixon had a lot of cunning. He had some pretty good instincts, as we covered under the Module 3 about federal laws, clean air, clean water, and such things. But in terms of his personal ambition, in terms of his sort of twisted view of the world, he acted them out. I think one of the worst things he did was that he promised in 1972 that he had a secret plan to end the war in Vietnam and told people, just believe me, I've got a secret plan. Well, he had no secret plan. The war went on for a couple of years after he was reelected. The question is, what do we do with such scoundrels and sociopaths in our midst? Do we elect them to office? Do we buy their products? Do we listen to the radio broadcasts? Do we seek their medical treatment? What do we do?